Next reading of Scripture, which comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man, his manager, was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, and you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do? Now that my master is taking my position away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I'm dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, make it 50. Then he asked another, 'How much do you owe?' And he replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to true riches? If you've not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord lives forever. And this is the word of the Lord. All thanks be to God. Well, Jesus really is challenging us to think about how attached we are to the material world. And it's a theme, you may have noticed, it's a theme that Jesus brings up a lot on his way to the cross, which is where we are now. Kind of halfway there, kind of in between Galilee and Jerusalem somewhere. We're in the middle part of the journey towards the cross, where today he turns to his disciples and he tells a story. The dishonest manager, he squanders his master's property. I remember just last week we came from the lesson on the lost and found, the sheep, the coin, the prodigal son, talking about how distressing it is to lose and how joyful it is to find, especially when it's a sinner who repents. The prodigal son, he squandered all of his inheritance on dissolute living. He blew it all in Vegas, doing very bad things. I'll let you imagine the possibilities. The manager was doing that with his boss's property. Same thing the prodigal son was doing, out living it up. That's what the manager was doing to the boss's property. He was squandering it, living it up, letting his boss's money go down the drain. He said he was taking care of his boss's stuff, but he wasn't. He lied. He wasn't managing anything. He was dishonest, and things were becoming a mess. So once his boss found out, his boss was ready to fire him right then and there. Boss called his manager in and said, "Show me everything you've been up to, and then you're fired." Now keep in mind that the boss was just as dishonest as the manager. It doesn't really make a big show out of that in the scripture. It's just something we have to kind of read in between the lines. The manager was being dishonest with his boss's dishonest money. His master was running a very common racket. Extremely high interest loans. Not that every high interest loan is dishonest, it makes sense to cover your bases when you're offering a high-risk loan, of course. But that's not what this guy is doing. This guy's business model is specifically built on ruining people's lives. So, the thing about this, 2,000 years removed, and on the other side of the earth, we can still recognize what's going on here. These kinds of loans and interest, the goals of the lenders, the unfair and impossible situations that borrowers end up in. It was very common in that day and time and place for a loan of money to come with 25% interest. And then a loan of goods, grain, oil, whatever, typically came with 50% interest. All right, and that's just what the lender, what the boss was charging. And then you have the manager coming in, collecting that money, and the manager doubles the final price of the bill, so the manager can fatten his pockets too. So, it's a common racket. All right, charge the people too much. Profit a lot in the meantime. And then, whenever they're unable to pay their bill, you take their family, home, and the land. That is actually what the common goal for these lenders in this time and place was. Very common that these lenders, ultimately, they wanted the land. So this was all just something to do in the meantime to take the land legally. So, that in addition to what the manager was doing, unless you're familiar with that knowledge, you're aware of what's going on there, you're familiar with it in our day and time, without that knowledge, frankly, I'm not really sure who Frank is, but frankly, this is a tricky parable to wrap our minds around. I've always struggled with this parable. But we are very familiar with what's going on here as soon as we know some of that information. Nothing foreign about this concept. High interest payday loans, high interest car loans. So last week, we were looking for a car for our daughter. I don't think I've mentioned it actually, but she got in an accident. It was like a hit and run, but she's okay, and we just never made a big deal out of it. But her car was totaled, and then insurance money came in from it. Thank goodness she's okay. Our big challenge was finding a new car. So we found a car, right? Great condition, good price. Using insurance money from the last car, offering a large down payment. We were going to have her finance the rest, a small amount, so she give like a good but not too demanding way to build her credit. And this loan that they came with, it was too much like this parable to even like it should be possible. They came with one of those predatory loans. The interest rates, because of the loan, the cost of the price of the car went up. And then, including the loan, that car, that price was literally double the price for the car. Literally. And actually a little more than double. Not 2 cars for one. No, we're talking paying for the same car twice. That kind of loan, it leaves people unable to pay the bill. And then after they've paid what they could and come up with enough for the next bill, the lender has made their money in the meantime, then they get the car back too. Big profit on one end, suffering people on the other. In a worse spot than they were, trying to dig themselves out in the first place from their hole by buying a car, and just to find their situation getting worse than it was to start with. Needless to say, we did not take that offer because we didn't have to. But a lot of people out there have no other choice than to take a predatory loan to try to climb out of a hole, only to find their hole getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's exactly what the master and his manager were doing to people. Now, in Jeremiah's message earlier, he was lamenting over the suffering of his poor people. Usually, Jeremiah is speaking God's words, but here, this is a different example. In this passage, Jeremiah is speaking his own words. He himself is relating to the people who are suffering. He himself is suffering because of the suffering of his people. He said, "My heart is sick within me. Hark the outcry of my poor people from the land far and wide." Grieving, like the father in the prodigal son story, grieving over his son who was lost before coming home. It reflects God's compounded grief over the different ways God loses us. God's heart is sick with grief over awful worldly ways. And God's heart is sick with grief over the suffering people that leaves. The manager, he knew that. He'd been to synagogue, but like a lot of other people, he didn't care. He was living it up until the boss came in. Well, once the manager was about to lose his job after the boss called him on it, he decides of course he's going to have to own up to his dishonesty. But in that moment, he also thought about his situation very carefully and came up with some more wise decisions. He came up with a very wise plan. The manager said to himself, all right, once he sees this mess, I'm done. There's no chance for me. I'm out of here. I've got to come up with something. I can't do manual labor. And these people we've been ruining, they're never going to let me into their homes once I hit rock bottom. This is going to be really bad. So, and then he comes out with this wise plan to deal with the situation. And this translation, it calls him shrewd. But I don't like that word. And maybe you all are a little more familiar with the word. It just hits me wrong. It hits my ear like a bad word, like the manager was doing something wrong. But shrewd is actually just intelligent, wise, sensible. So in the Greek Bible dictionary, in the lexicon, it defines that Greek word there as sensibly. So the manager acted sensibly when it says he acted shrewdly. The manager decided to deal with those people sensibly, wisely. He made things right with them, or at least as right as he could make them. His goal was there, he had no chance, so he was just going to go for broke, cross his fingers, faithfully serve his master to the very end, bring his master's money in, and make friends with those people that he hurt. How he decided to make things right was the really sensible part, the really wise part. It doesn't say exactly, but I believe the manager cut out his own profit from those deals. I think he collected the master's money, take a bill of 100, make it 50. I think that 50 was the master's money, and then he sacrificed his other 50. To make that sacrifice and to make it right with the people he'd hurt. There's also a Jewish religion component in there too, the year of Jubilee, when borrowers are forgiven their debts. So it kind of rings a little bit of Jubilee, what he was doing with people. It's a good religious note too. He went to borrow, you owe 100, make it 50. Then he went to the next borrower, you owe 100 containers of wheat, well, make it 80. How he decided those different numbers, it doesn't say. I'm not entirely sure. I guess it's relative to either what he's charging on top, or it's relative to what the people can actually pay. One way or another, he was choosing wisely to bring his master's money in and to make friends. And then, whatever the difference was in his decision-making, the boss recognized him, and the boss commended him for it. In the end, because of the manager's wise maneuvering through this very worldly situation, he managed to become faithful to his boss, which he wasn't before. He was dishonest. But he became faithful to his boss, and he made friends at the same time. In his own way, in his spot in this story, the manager repented. That lost manager became found. His boss became happy with him. It doesn't say that the manager got his job back, but that wise move made his boss happy, so he served him well, and he made friends with the people he could lean on for a long time to come, and actually far beyond the time of him working as a manager. After passing from this reality into the next, he'd have friends to lean on for eternity. That's the thing about choosing between God and wealth. Wealth, the Greek word for wealth, it's manna. Like manna the Israelites received in the wilderness to keep them going from day to day, that they couldn't collect too much or it would go bad and all this stuff. They could only collect what they could use for that day and move on. It was temporary, and then they get more manna the next day. That's what the wealth is here. It's the material stuff we survive on and enjoy, but it comes and goes. in the end, it means nothing. It's just gone. It's not sensible, it's not wise, it's not shrewd to devote ourselves to material stuff. Sure, it matters now, but it won't matter forever. It won't last. But God, on the other hand, does. God matters forever. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, we really can't be devoted to the two masters at the same time, God and wealth. No matter what we say, no matter how hard we try, in reality, there's only one of the two who's really being served. Jesus needs us to choose which one is actually most important to us, the temporary or the eternal. Because how we behave on earth, it matters. It matters to Jesus. It matters not only on heaven, it matters also, not only on earth, but it matters also in heaven. Jesus knows good and well how messed up this world is. Jesus grieves over how messed up this world is. And Jesus knows that we have to live in it. If we happen to be in a dishonest job, then we should be faithful within that job. Find ways within that job to bless people. Even if that means making personal sacrifices. Jesus needs faithful, honest, and trustworthy people. If we're faithful with whatever we've been given on earth, then there's no doubt that we'll be faithful with what Jesus has to give us in heaven. Once we gain our first glimpse of the kingdom, our whole understanding of profit and riches will be redefined. You know, someone once said that if you really want to know how rich you are, just add up all the things that you have that money can't buy, and all the things that death can't take away. That tells you how rich you really are. As Jesus challenged us to think about how attached we are to the material world, how much we care about the material world, how devoted we are to it. As Jesus is on his way to the cross, he's calling us to engage ourselves in this world that is plenty unjust, corrupt. He calls us to engage ourselves in this world as sensible, wise people of faith. Jesus needs the church to not be attached to the material world, but to use the material world to help build God's kingdom. To make friends, even in the case of dishonest wealth. To use everything we can reach to bless people, to heal relationships, to spread love, and to spread peace. And when we see with God's vision, we'll want to bless people. We'll want to serve our only one master. Because we'll see far beyond this moment of time and place. So let us devote ourselves fully to our one master. May God's children be found and blessed.